Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be doing a BIOS walkthrough for the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Xtreme. This BIOS should be relatively similar to the rest of Gigabyte's X570 lineup, except the motherboards that don't have the Aorus branding, so there's a distinction. The Aorus motherboards have basically a nicer BIOS than the non-Aorus motherboards. That's kind of that. So anyway, yeah, let's get right into it. And the first step of using the BIOS is to not use easy mode. So we go into advanced mode. You get there by pressing F2. One shortcut definitely worth remembering is F1 because that'll bring up this menu and that'll show you all of the other shortcuts that you could possibly need in the BIOS. So now that we're in advanced mode, the first tab you're going to be dumped into is the tweaker tab. Here you have your BCLK, which is this first menu right here. As you can clearly see, it goes on forever, so you probably don't want to scroll through that, but just punch in values. However, it is worth noting that adjusting your BCLK will potentially break your PCIe, it'll potentially break your SATA, and with this motherboard so far, I've not actually been able to do any BCLK overclocking whatsoever. It just immediately stops recognizing SATA devices, so I can't get into it. Like, I've not been able to mess with it for, like, benchmarking purposes because I can't get into Windows as soon as I start using it. If you just have it locked at 100, that works just fine. Other than that, you also have the option to disable BCLK spread spectrum. So basically, if you're in Windows and your BCLK is not quite 100 megahertz, that's because of spread spectrum. The spread spectrum basically varies the BCLK by a small amount. It's done for EMI compliance. You probably are going to be just fine if you disable it. Some motherboards don't have this feature, probably because they physically don't support disabling spread spectrum. So, as in their clock gen literally just doesn't have an option to configure that. Anyway, so it's just permanently enabled. So next we have CPU clock ratio. So that's just your CPU ratio multiplier. So yeah, you can use that. Static overclocking on Ryzen 3rd Gen really doesn't make much sense, so I don't know why you'd be too concerned about that. I need to moving the wrong mouse. Anyway, next we have the advanced CPU settings. Here we have core performance boost, which you can have enabled or disabled, so you can disable the boost system. There's no point like intentionally disabling this. If you're running a static overclock, it'll disable itself. And if you're using PBO, then you want that enabled anyway. Then we have SVM mode. I don't know what this does, but it's well, it does something related to CPU virtualization. I have zero experience with that, so I don't know what it does, but it exists if you need it. Next, we have global C states control, so you can disable C states. If you're doing static overclocking, it might help your stability to disable them. Otherwise, you should just leave them on auto or enabled, which auto is enabled. So it's kind of that. Then you have power supply idle control, which you can... So if you have an old power supply that doesn't support really low current draws, you can set it to low typical current idle. But if you have a modern PSU, which I would assume you have, if you're buying an X570 motherboard, you're probably buying a new PSU as well as a new... Like, you know, you're buying a whole new system probably. So hopefully you're using a new, modern, nice PSU and not a pile of trash that, honestly, like, you really shouldn't have picked up. So you shouldn't need to actually worry about this and just leave it on auto as well. Next, we have CCD control. So I have a single CCD. So here, if you had like a 3900X, you could choose to not have both core cluster dies enabled or compute cluster dies. I don't really care what it stands for. You get the idea. Basically, you can disable the CCD. So if you had a 3900X or a 3950X, you could go from being 6.6 to being 6.0, right? Or 8.0. So you can disable half the chip. Disable one of the chiplets. There might be there are overclocking scenarios, like for competitive overclocking that might make sense, but there's no real use case I can think of for anything but that. Then we have down core control. Here you can disable cores, which you probably would just buy a chip with less cores, unless you're doing competitive overclocking, in which case, again, there are scenarios where it makes sense to just not run so many damn cores. Next, we have SMT mode. So this is your simultaneous multi-threading. You can disable it. On auto, it is, of course, enabled. So it could actually make sense. Like, in certain scenarios, it can make sense. Like in competitive overclocking, again, there's uses for disabling this because it gives you a slight boost in single-threaded performance. There's also some benchmarks that actually really like break if you have too many threads available. 3D Mark Vantage is a perfect example of this. If you have more than 16 threads, like if you have more than like 20 threads, I think, the benchmark just freaks out and the score is terrible. So you have, like, if you have a 12 core or a 14 core or like a 16 core CPU, you really don't want to have hyperthreading or simultaneous multi-threading enabled with that. So that's kind of one use case for this. Other than that, there are applications that you might be running where you don't actually want simultaneous multi-threading. It does give you a very small nudge in terms of single-threaded performance. So, like, personally, I could totally understand, like, well, it's not particularly cost effective, but if you had like a 3900X or a 3950X and all you ever did was gaming, it could make sense to just disable the multi-threading because you don't need it, right? You still have 16 cores and you get a little bit of an edge in terms of single-threaded performance because it basically takes off some load off of the memory system. Anyway, so that's that option down there. Next, we have the XMP profiles. You can enable them, you can disable them, right? Not much to it if you enable it. You have frequency support here, which I'm not sure what this does. I assume it's basically... yeah, they don't have an option description, so... I assume that is like that's some kind of compatibility mode thing, where it's like if you have certain memory kits that the motherboard has a hard time with, you can mess around with this to try get them working, but you really shouldn't have too many issues with memory on 3rd gen unless you do something silly like buy four sticks of 4400 megahertz BDI, which generally doesn't tend to go very well. Anyway, next we have system memory multiplier. So here you can change your memory ratio. Goes all the way up to 60. Not that you're actually ever going to be able to hit that. Yeah, and anyway, like that exists, so we'll put that back to disabled. Next we have the advanced memory settings. Here you have memory sub-timings, and here you can have, like, you have all of your timings, right? All of your timings. The only setting that is missing from here is the power down disable, and we'll find that elsewhere in the BIOS. So that's a bit buried. A lot of other motherboards would actually include that setting in here, but it's not a... Like, there's a functionality that I'll show off later that basically takes care of the whole... Like, Gigabyte is still not the best at organizing their BIOS, as far as I'm concerned, so they do have a function to sort of work around that, but yeah, we'll cover that later. But so here's all of your sort of memory timings, right? Memory timings, and also a lot of your memory configuration options as well. Next, we have SPD info, so you can basically check the SPDs of your different memory sticks. So, yep, that works. Next, you have CPU vCore. You know, you can change your core voltage. You can go all the way up to 1.8 volts from 0.75. You can punch that value in, of course. You don't have to scroll through the whole menu because that would be silly. Also, if you want to do offset voltage, you actually have to put that into normal, and then you can punch in your offsets down here. So, you know, which the offset input is a bit awkward. So ideally, you'd like go 0, and then you can use the minus key to go up and down, because the issue with that is if we go to auto and you hit minus on it, like, you can't punch in minus 0.1. You can't also punch in plus 0.0 whatever, right? Like, so it's a bit awkward, but it works, right? It's not a huge issue. Offset voltage can be useful if you're doing precision boost overdrive overclocking a little bit. And yeah, and we'll not get into what static voltage you should run because it's kind of a long topic, and yeah, you really shouldn't, like, as far as I'm concerned with Ryzen 3rd gen, so far, I've not seen a CPU where it makes a, well, there are some chips that are, like, actually really good at static overclocks, and those can make sense to run static, but most CPUs, I'm going to say, you don't actually want to run them static. You should just use the precision boost overdrive system, in which case, you know, you're probably just going to run a little bit of a voltage offset, or you're just going to be on auto voltages anyway. And if you're running a voltage offset, it's going to be negative, so there's no real concern. It is worth noting that with the negative offset voltages, if you set the offset too low, you're going to have instability, so that's something to watch out for. Anyway, next we have vCore SoC. For some reason, Gigabyte seems to default that to, and let me check. Yeah, they like to... Okay, so no, they're not defaulting it that high. Okay, I'm going to tell them to fix that, because that is stupid. So, it says 1.2 volts here, right? And as far as I know, so that is actually like the voltage at which Gigabyte motherboards lose PCIe 4.0 functionality. MSI motherboards apparently like do it at 1.1 volts. I'm not sure how Gigabyte managed to make that happen at 1.2 instead. maybe like I don't have any PCIe 4.0 devices to actually validate that like when it happens, but I've been told that that's the voltage where it happens for Gigabyte boards. Anyway, you probably, if you're doing any kind of memory overclocking, you're going to want to stick to around 1.1 volts SoC anyway. There's not really, like, it's not like 1.2 volts is harmful. The IO die is built on 12 nanometer, but the thing is just like you're probably not going to see any benefit from running 1.2 volts SoC. The one thing to keep in mind with your SoC voltage is that there's a voltage that is regulated down from the SoC voltage, which is the VDDG voltage. So if you want to set like 1.1 volts VDDG, you actually need at least 1.15 SoC voltage, because the VDDG rail is it's a linear regulator, and it has a minimum dropout voltage of like 50 millivolts. So if you have 1.1 volts SoC and your VDDG is set to 1.1, you're going to get 1.05 VDDG, because it can't run at the same voltage as SoC. So anyway, we'll set that to auto right now. Then we have CPU VDD 1.8. This voltage can help a little bit with overclocking at ambient, depending on your CPU. Bumping it up to around, say, 1.9, 1.96 volts is going to be safe. Actually, I do believe it turns red eventually. Does it? Oh, wait. Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay, so, but that's an oddly low max value for that. That's interesting. So on LN2, during on liquid nitrogen, that voltage is actually hugely useful for max core clock, but at ambient, it really isn't useful. So, doesn't tend to be particularly useful. Again, bumping it up to 1.9-ish might help if you're doing static overclocks. But again, you should probably be running precision, like you should probably be doing a precision boost overdrive overclock anyway, so I don't really see a use case for that. But it exists, and there are some other boards that don't have that, and that disqualifies them from LN2 overclocking. Anyway, next we have VDDP. This is a memory controller voltage. You should honestly just leave this on auto. It might make sense to tweak that voltage a little bit. You don't want to go above like 1.01. I think for that one, you don't want to go above 1.1 volt. But generally, let me just check that is actually what it, yeah. Generally, you're going to be best off just leaving it auto, because it sits at 0.95 volts and it's fine there. In some cases, it might make sense to drop it to like 0.85, but really you shouldn't have to mess with it at all. Then we have CLDO 1.2 volts. So this is from the chipset. If you like, I don't know why you'd want to do anything to the chipset voltages. I'm not aware of them having any uses. Maybe if you're pushing like weird, like high BCLK overclocks, it might make sense to try tweak the chipset voltages a bit. But other than that, you should just, as far as I'm concerned, just ignore that, ignore this, and ignore this, because yeah, that's for the chipset, and the chipset does doesn't do anything. If you're again, if you're on PBO, it doesn't matter. If you're on LN2, there might be scenarios where, you know, tweaking these voltages help with stability, but for most use cases, it's just like, nah, ignore these. Next, we have memory voltage. So obviously, this is the voltage you will configure for if you're doing any kind of memory overclocking. For that, I generally go with the guideline of going up to maximum 1.5 volts. Because it might be a little bit too far on the safe side, but you know, nobody ever complained about their memory not dying or their memory controller not dying. So I like to stick to 1.5 volts, because also going up to like 1.6, you're not necessarily going to see some huge increase in performance. Anyway, so yeah, it's just kind of like stick to 1.5. We're going to put that back down to auto. Then we have DDR VPP. This is a supporting rail for the memory. In my experience, that voltage does absolutely nothing for memory overclocking. I have heard there are some cases where it does help, but my personal experience is it doesn't help. It's completely useless. You can just act like it doesn't exist, and leave it on auto, which is supposed to be, by spec, that voltage is supposed to be 2.5 volts. Next, we have DRAM termination voltage. This voltage is supposed to be half of your DRAM voltage, so if you have 1.5 volts there, this one should be 0.75, you know, the guideline there is just like keep it within. Well, the thing is, you're not really like there's a guideline for what a safe value range is. I've forgotten that right now, but the thing is, most of the time you're going to be fine if you just leave it on the auto setting of, you know, half your DIMM voltage, which the board will do on auto. If you leave that auto, it'll do that for you. In some cases, it might make sense, like You know, you might have a memory kit that's a little bit weird. So at 1.5 volts, it actually overclocks better if you have the termination voltage set to 0.7 or maybe to 0.8. And even, you know, some memory kit might even like 0.85. But generally speaking, it works best if you just leave it at half your VDIM. And yeah, you shouldn't really need to mess with it, though it can help with memory overclocking in some scenarios. Now, it's a useful voltage to keep in mind, but you know, it's far more useful than, say, DDR VPP, which does, as far as I'm concerned, literally nothing. But termination voltage can help in some scenarios. Anyway, so we're going to set those back to auto now and go to the CPU VRM settings. Here we have our load line calibration. If you're going to be doing static overclocking, I would strongly recommend you stick within the sort of high turbo load line range, because Ultra, Extreme, and Extreme, they're very low V-droop, and they basically... Like, well, Ultra Extreme has no V-droop. Extreme is very low V-droop. You shouldn't be using them. There's, for reasons I'm not going to get into here. But anyway, there's your low line settings. They go from low to extreme. Turbo, high, medium. Like, these are the settings that I think you might actually want to use. Everything above that, no. Just no. Because the voltage regulator just doesn't keep up with them. Anyway, also the board. Like, there's that graph for the load line scaling in the back. That updates when you actually select an option. So, yeah, if you're wondering why that wasn't changing as I was scrolling through the menu, that's why. Next, we have SoC load line calibration. This one I would just set to high or turbo and forget about it. And even if you're doing PBO, like, manually set your SoC load line. It's a low current rail, so it's not super, sensitive. So that's why, you know, it's like high turbo is going to be fine for that. Or you can just leave it auto. That works just fine as well. vCore protection, you can max out, which if you're doing static overclocking, you should just max that out. SoC protection, you should just max it out as well. Actually, you can have both of these maxed out all the time anyway. Like, there's no reason to not max them out. Like, but yeah. There's a lot of motherboard, like, because the thing is, there's a lot of motherboards that just don't have those, right? Like, I don't know, MSI and Gigabyte have these protection settings, but a lot of other board, like, say, ASRock and Asus, they don't bother with these. They're just not available options, because I assume they're permanently disabled, because I've never run into those boards ever hitting, like, an overvoltage protection, whereas Gigabyte, like, I've had a motherboard from Gigabyte where I would actually, like, hit a voltage protection system if these weren't maxed out, so it's, yeah, just max them out as far as I'm concerned. And I'm pretty sure they default to 350 millivolts anyway, based on the fact that that's what's sitting right there next to them. Anyway, next we get the CPU vCore current protection. If you're doing static overclocking, just max out your current protection, right? Like, the thing is like, well, just max it out. I'm not going to get into the reasons why. Okay, it's just like, if you're bouncing of the, like, well, no, like, the bigger concern is the voltage you set, not the current, okay? The voltage dictates the current. So if your current, like, the OCP is, like, I don't get the point of having an OCP. The OCP is a VRM protection feature. This motherboard, and actually Gigabyte's entire X570 motherboard lineup, has very strong VRMs, so it's completely useless from that perspective. It's not going to protect the CPU, because you can blow up the CPU with too much voltage way before the current actually becomes an issue. So I would just max that out and not worry about it. And then we have PWM phase control. You know, if you want to run the VRM for all the phases all the time, you put it into extreme performance. Otherwise, you can select some of the other options. It works fine on auto. As far as I can tell, there's really no reason to change that either. Yeah, Ryzen, Ryzen overclocking. Leave everything on auto unless you're on liquid nitrogen or dry ice or some kind of sub-zero cooling. Because, yeah, it really doesn't make much sense to do anything else. On Gigabyte motherboards that use the IR 35201 controller or the Intersil ISL 69138 or 147, I'm not sure, but this motherboard uses an Infineon XDP 132G5C, so we actually get less VRM settings in this BIOS than, say, the X570 Pro or the X570 Elite, and that's because we have a different voltage controller. So, yeah, the extra settings you'll get is just like, I think I've explained them in some other video, and if I haven't, then you can get information on those elsewhere. I can't include them in this video because I actually don't remember what extra options you get. I think it only adds switching frequency, which is just like, if the VRM is running cool enough, there's no reason not to max out the switching frequency. Anyway, that covers the entire tweaker tab at this point. So that's pretty cool. Let's go into the settings tab. And here we get into the section of the BIOS where there's a lot of settings that I'm going to be like, this exists. I don't know what it does. I don't know why it exists. But, you know, you might need this setting. So that's what this part of the video is for. So anyway, here we have what to do after AC power is restored. The option description actually explains that perfectly just fine. So, you know, oh, well, it doesn't explain what the memory setting does, so that'll just go back to whatever state the system was in before the AC power before AC power loss. So if it was turned on and then you lose AC power and then the AC power is restored, then it'll go back to turned on. If it was turned off and the AC power, you know, you have AC power loss and then AC power comes back on, it'll stay off. So that's what that is. Then we have ERP, which I have no idea what that is at all. Then we have soft off by power button. Oh, I guess this is to prevent yourself from accidentally hitting the power button and having the system shut down unexpectedly. Then you have power loading. I assume this is similar to the low current idle of the PSU for like the PSU settings and the CPU settings. So yeah, anyway, you can enable, disable that or leave it auto. Then we have resume by alarm, you can enable. Then you have timer, like alarm settings, I guess. Yeah, time settings for that. You can disable that again. Wake on LAN, you can enable, disable. High precision event timer, you can enable, disable. Yeah, I've not messed with the high precision event timer at all for like anything, so yeah, I'm not aware of any issues with it. So, you know, probably leaving it enabled is just fine. Anyway, next we have I/O ports. So here we have I/O settings. So you can choose which. If you have, say, 3 GPUs installed, you can choose which GPU is the primary GPU based on which PCIe slot it's in. Then you can enable, disable your HD audio controller. So the onboard audio, you can enable, disable that. PCIe X16 by purification. If you're running M.2 SSDs off of your PCIe slots, you can enable 4x4, I think, is the one you want for that. So yeah, you're going to want to play with that for that. Then we have above 4G decoding, which you can enable, disable. I think this is for recognizing more PCIe devices on the PCIe slots. I'm not 100% certain. But if you know you need that setting, well, it exists. So that's that. You can choose your front panel USB 3.1 Type-C Gen speed. So it can be 3.1 Gen 2, 3.1 Gen 1. Isn't that an incredibly stupid naming scheme? It is an incredibly stupid naming scheme. Anyway, we can leave that back on auto. Onboard LAN controller, you can enable your... I'm actually not... like, so this board, this being the Xtreme, it comes with a Quantia 10 gig. It comes with Intel 1 gig LAN. I don't know which one's which, but you can disable both of them if you're... you know, if you don't want to have LAN enabled, you can disable both of them for whatever reason. It can... during extreme overclocking, you'll often disable a lot of your extra like onboard devices just because it helps post times and sometimes with stability as well. Anyway, next we get the USB configuration. We have legacy USB support. You can enable, disable, auto that. XHCI handoff, which you can enable or disable. USB mass storage drive support. You can enable, disable. Port 6064 emulation. You can disable or enable. It's disabled by default. Next, we have NVMe configuration. There's nothing here because I don't have any NVMe devices, so can't show you what the settings there are. Next, we have SATA mode. You can choose AHCI or RAID. Then you have this. Actually, I wonder what changes if you go into RAID. Yeah, I no experience with that, so but you can enable RAID mode. Anyway, next we have NVMe RAID mode, which you can enable or disable. You have actually, does that change anything? No, it doesn't. You have chipset SATA ports enabled, so you can disable all your SATA ports if you feel like it. Because as far as I know, all of the SATA ports on this motherboard are off of the chipset. So if you want to not have any SATA ports, you can disable them. I think they're all off the chipset. Anyway, next you have chipset SATA port hot plug, so you can enable, disable hot plugging the SATA devices. So yeah, that's enabled by default. Anyway, next we have the network stack configuration where you can enable, disable that, and then it comes up with all these options, which I don't know what any of these do, so but they exist. So I'll just put that back to enabled, right? Oops. At least it remembers. Yeah, so that's and there. So all of this exists. I don't know anything about it, but yeah, it's there if you need it. Then we have some Intel networking configuration settings. You can change your link. Yeah, you can enable, disable wake on LAN. You can change the speed of the LAN as well. So it's kind of that. Next we have miscellaneous settings. So here we have LEDs in sleep state. So you can disable, enable the RGB on the motherboard. Right, so off, onboard button light. Oh, I think that's for the rear I/O buttons on the back of the... Yeah, that's for the rear I/O buttons, so you can have those lit up or not lit up. Onboard debug port LED. I'm not sure where that is or what that is, but you can turn it off if you feel like it. Oops. Anyway, next we have PCIe slot configuration. You can go Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4. You know, lowering the PCIe link speed can be useful when doing BCLK overclocking because, again, it screws with the PCIe. So that's kind of that's mainly the main use of this option. It can also help maybe with some compatibility issues sometimes. 3D Mark 01 enhancement. So basically, this exists to boost 3D Mark 01 scores, and that's it. As far as I know, that's the only purpose that has. Next, we have IOMMU. I don't know what this does, but it exists. You can enable it, you can disable it, you can leave it auto. Then we have AMD CPU FTPM, which I think is trusted platform. Yeah, that's going to be trusted platform module stuff. Again, I don't know what it does, but the setting exists. Then we have trusted computing, which you can enable, disable, but there's no secure. Like, again, I don't have whatever this requires, so this is what's in this menu right now. Anyway. Next, we get to the AMD CBS menu. This is where we find a lot of settings that you're going to wish that were in the tweaker menu. So let's start going through these. Performance, you have custom P states, accept. I would, like, my experience with custom P states is that it sucks to try mess with these. And so I just pretend that they don't exist. But if you want to play with that, then yeah, that exists. And you're free to do so. Next, we have prefetcher settings. Honestly, don't know what these do, but you can enable and disable them. So, yeah, I just leave them auto because that seems to work just fine. Memory interleaving. I do know what this does. You do want to keep this on auto. You want to keep that enabled because if you disable it, basically, you'll lose memory performance if you disable your memory interleaving. So, just leave that auto. DRAM controller configuration, DRAM power options. This is where your power down enable is located. If you're doing memory overclocking, it can help to disable that. It's basically a power saving feature, which not really much use for on a desktop, especially since it's for like the memory, which really doesn't pull that much power in the first place. So, yeah, but you can leave that on auto if you like. If you don't have any issues, there's no reason to disable it. But if you're having stability issues, it might make like you might see some benefit from disabling this. Anyway, auto. Next we have, and this is one of those settings that, well, now you can set it once and kind of forget about it if you save a profile, of course. Then we have XFR enhancement. This is where you're going to find your FCLK frequency, and this is where I would like to present this feature of the BIOS, which is the insert shortcut right here. Add remove item from favorites list. So yeah, we're going to hit insert on that because that is a very useful setting that is not present in the tweaker tab. There's no FCLK anywhere in here because Gigabyte. So, you know, if you're going to be messing with your memory and your fabric FCLK frequency, you're going to want to hit the insert key on that so that it gets added to your favorites tab so you don't have to dig through the CBS menu every time you want to find that. Actually, you're probably going to, like, you know, depending on what you're doing, you might want to add a whole bunch of settings to your favorites tab. Usually what I do is I have my FCLK. I also add the memory subtiming option, right? So I can quickly get to that, quickly change the FCLK here. So anyway, you get the idea. So you can just add a bunch of settings to the favorites tab. If you don't want a setting in there anymore, you can just hit insert on it and it'll remove it. So back to the AMD CBS menu. So in XFR enhancement, FCLK frequency, you can tweak your FCLK frequency. SoC overclock vid, don't change that. There's no point. You can set the vid of your SoC voltage, but I really wouldn't recommend using that. Just leave it alone. The motherboard, like you can just set the SoC voltage from here. The motherboard will take care of the rest for you. Anyway, next we have UCLK Div 1 mode, so you can set the memory to be, well, for the memory controller to be synchronized to the memory clock, or you can have the memory controller to run at half the speed of the memory clock. UCLK equals MMCLK divided by 2 is terrible for performance, but that's the only, but it allows you to hit very high memory frequencies, mostly for showing off purposes, because again, it leads to god-awful performance. So if you're doing any kind of serious overclocking, you should really have that on UCLK equals MMCLK. It makes some sense to add this to your favorites tab, because it's worth noting that if you clear CMOS, your favorites tab does not get wiped. So all of the stuff you add to favorites is going to stay in favorites even through a clear CMOS. So anyway, we're going to set that right back to auto. Next, we have VDDP voltage control. So this is a memory controller supporting rail. I would honestly leave it auto, but you might be wondering, well, I want to screw with it. So the way you adjust this voltage is you actually punch in the value. So right now I punched in 1.11 1110 millivolts, so 1.11 volts. I think the safe range for this voltage is up to 1050. Though generally, I think I've heard that because again, this is one of those voltages that I personally just leave auto because the boards to handle it. Well, I don't. It probably just stays at the same value, but I've heard that sort of tweaking it in the range from like 800 to 950. Can lead to better memory overclocking on certain CPUs in certain situations. Anyway, I'm going to put that right back to auto. Next, we have VDDG. So this is the main voltage for your FCLK overclocking. You know, if you're trying to stabilize a high FCLK frequency like 1900 megahertz FCLK or even 1866 or something, right? It depends on the quality of your CPU. 1800, 1833, 1867, and 1900, they all could pose issues. You're going to want to tweak your VDDG voltage up to, like, it makes sense to tweak up to, say, 1100. But at that point, you're going to need your SoC voltage to be above your VDDG voltage. So your SoC voltage for this would have to be like 1.15. So yeah, generally, you're probably going to stop at like 1050 unless you want to run high SoC voltage. Anyway, this is another one of those settings that honestly, I just set it auto, and I would insert it, and I think, yeah. So then you get your VDDG voltage here, which is useful, of course. Can remove that. I'm going to go to XFR enhancement, and we're going to put that right back to auto. So that's the voltage that you'd mess with to try stabilize high frequency FCLK overclocks. Next, we have SoC Encore OC mode. This will lock basically it'll stop the I/O die from downclocking at idle. Can help with stability when overclocking. You can leave it disabled, enabled, or auto. LN2 mode. This is, again, for LN2 overclocking. Basically, the CPU has some weird issues at low temperatures, so this takes care of those if you enable it. There's no reason to enable it at ambient. So let's just move on from there. Accept precision boost overdrive settings. Honestly, I think this isn't going to work, but we'll see. So manual, yeah, this is a problem. So this is this is one thing I don't like, is just like if you want to change your precision boost override it is overdrive. You need to go all the way to here. So I think the easiest way is to just set the accepted, and so then you go accepted and then go manual, and then you get to your PPT limits. Now, word of warning, if you do this to your settings, it causes a bug, because Gigabyte for some reason has the inputs for these uncapped, so you can actually roll them over. It leads to some rather strange issues, so I recommend you don't do that. You should really set some kind of power limit like that. Better. There. So that kind of power limit is a great power limit. So the thing is like you're supposed to just max it out, right? Any value that, like, honestly, yeah, any value above 400 is good. Just don't do this, right? Don't let it go to, like, actually even 999 is good, right? 9999, that's fine as well. Precision boost overdrive, scalar, you can disable it. You can set it to manual. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3 are very, like, slightly less aggressive in varying steps. Everything above 4 is the same thing. So from 4 to 10, it doesn't make a difference. So, and honestly, in my personal experience, like, as far as I can tell, there's not really much performance difference. I'd say it makes most sense to just, you know, set something like 999 for all of your limits. Then go to 5x overdrive scaler or 4x or 10x or whatever number you like. I like 5. 5 is a cool number in my opinion. And then maybe set a set a negative voltage offset of like say 50 millivolts, which this BIOS is gonna make spectacular to do. So there, and then you set like a 50 millivolt voltage offset. That's gonna lower your voltages a bit, and it's not gonna harm your boost behavior at all. Anyway, so that's one way to do things. And actually, yeah, so this is really silly. As you can clearly see, the voltage offset is not present. So we're just gonna insert that into our favorites tab as well. And unfortunately, there's no way to like rearrange it once it's in there, so you're gonna have to like remove and re-add options to get them in the order that you want. But anyway, you get the idea. We're gonna remove these two because we obviously don't need those anymore. But yeah, so I'll not bother with resetting those. But anyway, let's keep going through the CBS. So that's the XFR enhancement menu. We've gone through everything in there. Next, we have CTDP control, so you can set a power limit for the CPU. So if you want the CPU to never run on more than 50 watts, you can set it to run on 50 watts. If you want it to run on 1,000 watts, not that it can, you can tell it to try run on 1,000 watts. It's not actually going to manage that, but you can tell it. You can tell it to try do that. Anyway, we're going to set that right back to default. And yeah, for some reason that pops out 2 menu items down. I have no idea why. Anyway, next we have ACS. I have no idea what this is. You can enable, you can disable it. If you need it, I guess, if you don't, then, you're like me where it's just like, I don't know what that is. Next we have PCIe ARI support. Don't know what this does either, but you can enable it, you can disable it. So that's that. Then you have package power limit control. You can set that manual, which I assume behaves very similar to the CTDP control. And again, you can just max that. Like, I would honestly just set that to like 1,000 or 999 if you're doing PBO. And again, this bugs out the same way the XFR enhancement, the PBO limits do. Don't let it go to -1. Set it to an actual like high value if you want to max that out. Anyway, we're going to put that back on auto. CPC preferred cores. You can enable, disable that. This is basically I think this basically tells Windows which cores boost highest. I think that's the point of this. And that's kind of that. Anyway, moving on from there. So, you can enable, disable that as well. I don't see a reason why you'd want to disable that ever. So I just leave it auto. Next, we have the AMD Overclocking menu. This menu is very dangerous. Okay, everything in here, extremely dangerous. Because this menu does not clear if you clear the CMOS. Anything you punch in here stays in here forever, basically. I've not managed to clear any of the settings in here so far. And I did try things like pull the CPU out, remove the CMOS battery, like, I've not managed to clear this part. I'm not sure how it manages to do that. Anyway, we have manual CPU overclocking, which is like, this is just like the raw version of the features you have in the tweaker tab. Don't use them. Right? Like, this is like the dangerous version of what the tweaker tab offers. Then you have DDR settings, right? Which includes all of the timings. Again, these are just settings you can get through the tweaker tab. Really don't recommend that you mess with any of these. Power down enable, you can get that from AMD CBS, and the AMD CBS menu does clear when you clear the CMOS, so go through that one instead. You can change your command rate. Again, you can access that through the tweaker tab, right? If you go to tweaker, go to your advanced memory settings, memory subtimings. See that? That's your command rate. That's your gear down mode. Safe. Not safe. Right? Everything down here, not safe. So I would not use these. CAD bus things. Again, you can access these through the tweaker tab. You can access all of this through the tweaker tab as well. So I would not touch anything in here at all, right? Like, just leave it. Just forget that. Honestly, like this menu, honestly, I'd be very surprised if Gigabyte didn't just remove access to it at some point in time in some BIOS update, because there's really no reason to ever go in here. And there's a lot of things here where it's like you can seriously screw yourself over if you set them wrong. So yeah, anyway, that all exists. Then we have Infinity Fabrics FCLK settings. You can get these through AMD CBS, not through, I would not recommend, because here's the thing. If you go and just set this to like, oh, I don't know, 2000, right? Your CPU is never going to post ever, and you've basically bricked that BIOS. The board does have dual BIOS. This one does, so you could actually go to the other BIOS and use that. But yeah, I really strongly recommend you do not, set your FCLK from here, because you're not going to be able to clear it, and that is one way to definitely get yourself to never be able to post. Eco mode, you can enable, disable. I would strongly, again, it's in here. I would not touch anything in here. It's just like it exists. For some reason, it's not accessible from any other menus, which I think is just a oversight on Gigabyte's part, because a lot of other motherboards do give you access to that menu, like give you access to that item through like a normal safe menu instead of, well, here. Then you have Precision Boost Overdrive, which you have Advanced. This actually gives you some extra settings, not that there's any use to them. This one also does the rollover differently, but it's the same glitch. Like, that 65,000 is the same glitch as the -1. Like, the end result is the same. So you really, really shouldn't be using this. We should, go back. Oh yeah, there's motherboard limits, but Gigabyte doesn't have the motherboard. I'm not sure what the motherboard limits are, but I don't think they're configured. Anyway, I would just not touch anything in here again. You can leave that. Well, these are safer because I've not managed to set a combination of like PBO settings that doesn't post yet, but I still would recommend you just don't touch anything in the AMD overclocking menu. It's a very scary place as far as I'm concerned. You can change your overdrive scaler, which you can do from the AMD CBS as well, right? Max boost clock override. Oh yeah, so this option is only accessible through here. The funny thing is, this setting barely does anything on, like, my 3700X doesn't benefit from this setting at all. I have heard that apparently some 3600s, like the Ryzen 5 3600s, the 6 cores, some of those do benefit from this setting, but it's just like, well, okay, it's relative. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you could manage to, like, get your system to not post with this. Because, as I said, for my CPU, it doesn't do anything. I've not noticed any benefit from it, but I have messed with this setting. But, yeah, if you put it just back, like, I would just, I don't know, I'll tell Gigabyte to maybe add it to the AMD CBS menu, because I think there's, like, some difference in how the motherboard handles things in the AMD CBS menu compared to here. You could add it to your favorites. I just wouldn't recommend that. Right? Like, again, I wouldn't really recommend using anything from here. But, yeah, and then we have platform thermal limit, which, if you want to be able to melt your CPU, I don't know, maybe you want to try delid the CPU with the CPU's own heat output. Oh, so is an upper limit. What is it? Oh, 200. Yeah, 200 degrees Celsius. Yeah, that'll actually melt the indium solder. So you could try delid your CPU with just the heat from the CPU itself. I'd be very surprised if the CPU didn't die in the process. So I would recommend not doing that. But yeah, if you're feeling very brave or just really hate Ryzen CPUs, there's your setting. You can play with that. Anyway, here you can set the SoC voltage in a more dangerous way than, just from the tweaker tab. You like being adventure. Well, not enough adrenaline in your life. Set your SoC voltage from here. SoC on Core OC mode. Again, you can access this from AMD CBS. You can enable, disable it. It doesn't work any different from there. VDDP voltage. Again, if is your life not exciting enough, you can set VDDP from here. Is your VDDG... Like, wait, because, yeah, same thing. It does, the nice thing here is it does tell you this current setting, but it's just like, there's no reason to set it from here. Like, it might make sense to go here and check, like, what the default value is. But that's about the only use I can think of for this menu. Anyway, next we have onboard voltage controls. You can change your DRAM voltage in a more dangerous way because, your life's not exciting enough or something. So, yeah, that's an option, and then you can do the same for VTT. Again, I don't see why you'd want to use anything in this section of the BIOS because it does not clear properly. So I would just not touch it. Like the only option in this entire section of the BIOS that is worth maybe playing with is this one. Everything else is just like you can get these settings from elsewhere, and they'll actually clear properly. So I don't see a reason to access them through there. Anyway, next we have PC health status. So this is just a quick readout of your various voltages. These voltage readings, if I'm not mistaken, are from the Super I/O, and the Super I/O is kind of inaccurate. So if these voltages are off by tens of millivolts, that's completely normal. The Super I/O just sucks at monitoring voltages. This is more to give you a rough idea that a voltage is present, or roughly where it is, not so much the voltage is not exactly where it's supposed to be. Okay, it's not the purpose of this menu. Right, it's good for getting an idea of like, okay, so the SoC voltage is probably set to around 1.05 volts, right? Anyway, next we have Smart Fan 5. So this is where you get your fan control. I'm a big fan of Gigabyte's fan control in their BIOS because unlike some board vendors, you can do everything in here using the keyboard instead of the mouse, because mouse control in BIOS freaking sucks. The sensitivity is never high enough, or actually I think Gigabyte gives you an option to change your mouse sensitivity. Except I don't know why you'd do that. You can just use the keyboard like a civilized person instead of trying to use the mouse like an ape. Anyway, so, you know, yeah, you can choose a few different, so you have normal as a profile, you have a silent profile, you can set a manual profile. If you hold, you know, you can choose a point, then hold the shift button to move the point around. You know, you can move a point up, you can move it down, left, right, you get the idea. So nothing that not really anything that special, right? You can raise the minimum if you feel like it, how that works. Actually, it looks like you have a zero fan RPM option as well. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, so yeah, and if you have a custom curve that you configured and you want to apply it to all of your fans, you can actually use the apply to menu to apply it to all of your fans, which is pretty cool. Otherwise, you can go individually fan by fan to set a custom curve for each and every one of them. Except CPU optional for some reason. That one seems to, wait, apply to? Huh? Weird. Oh, wait, did it just apply that curve now to everything? Oh, I guess it just doesn't show up. Anyway. So that's a bit strange, but the fan control, like my experience with the fan control is if you fiddle with it for long enough, it'll work the way you want it to. And at least you don't have to use the mouse, which that's already a massive win in my book. So anyway, yeah, you can choose actually which temperature input to use for your fan curve. So you can tell it to go by the CPU or by the PCIe slot temperature sensor, or wait, wait. Why is it changing the curve? That's very strange. That's going to be the hysteresis for the fan. So how much like the temperature has to change before the PWM goes up and down. That's very odd. I think I managed to break something. Anyway, leave that on 1. You can choose between voltage control mode. So if you have a 3-pin fan, you want to run it in voltage mode. If you have a PWM fan, you want to run it in PWM mode. If you have something like Corsair maglevs, you have to use PWM mode because the maglev bearing runs off of the DC voltage. So if you start tweaking your voltage down, your DC voltage down, you're going to have a bad day because it screws with the bearing of those fans. Anyway, let's put that back up to auto. You can enable, disable fan stop. And then over here, you have some temperature readouts. I don't have any fans plugged in right now, but anyway, so you can check the... well, you can set temperature warnings. So you can have a temperature warning for the CPU at 90 degrees. Unfortunately, the temperature warning is always 90 degrees. So even for like your VRM, which you'd honestly, like, I'd want a temperature warning for the VRM at like 100 or 110. There's no way to set it to more than 90. So that's a bit of a limitation here, but not really a big deal. You know, if the motherboard doesn't need a temperature warning system for the VRM, that's just better in the first place, right? If you just have a VRM that doesn't overheat. Anyway, next we have sysfan2 fail warning. So you can enable, disable, like, did my fan fail warnings, that kind of thing. And you can do that for every fan in the system. You can put a warning on any fan not functioning, so that's pretty cool. And then down in the bottom here, you have a bunch of temperature readouts for the various sensors built into the motherboard. So, yeah, that's kind of that. So that's the Smart Fan 5 menu. Next we have the System Info menu. You can change your language. Oh, there's no check. That sucks. Okay. Well, I didn't expect there to be any check, but I was like, oh well. Anyway, I was just wondering if there might be. So you have English. You can set your system date and time. Right. Just wait. Yeah. So plus minus for changing those. It's wrong, isn't it? Yeah, it's wrong. Anyway, then you have plugged-in devices information, and you can access QFlash. This is where you update your BIOS. You can also save your current BIOS if you need to for some reason. And that's everything in here. So next we have the boot options. Here you can choose your boot order, right? Boot numlock state, security options. I don't know what that is actually. Full screen logo, fast boot. It's worth noting fast boot, if you have fast boot enabled, it'll skip memory training. So if you're doing memory overclocking, you should have it disabled. And then only after you're 100% certain that your memory overclock is stable is it reasonable to disable fast boot. I mean, enable fast boot. There. You can also use fast boot to like do some fancy tricks like booting memory frequencies that aren't very stable at all. That you can use it for that as well because it skips the memory training. So it's like if you have a set of settings that don't train because they're god awful and unstable, you can skip the training with fast boot, which is just like it might be useful for like screenshots or something. It's not really useful for any, like you probably won't be able to run benchmarks on settings that don't even train. So anyway, next we have compatibility, the CSM support. Then we have the LAN PXE. So this is if you have like old GPUs that don't support UEFI. Which I have piles of, so I really need that setting. Anyway, then you have LAN PXE boot option ROM. I don't know what this does, but you can enable, disable that. Storage option, UEFI only, legacy only, disabled. Other PCI devices, ROM priority, again. And then administrator password, you can set a password, you can set a user password. Preferred operating mode, you can tell it to go to easy mode, you can tell it to go to advanced mode every time you get into the BIOS. So I'm going to put that back to auto. Next we have save and exit. You can save, all of your options and exit. You can exit without saving. You can load optimize defaults. So that'll wipe out all the settings except the AMD overclocking menu. I know I've tried. That's actually really strange. Like it should be able to wipe that from this BIOS itself. Anyways, next we have boot override, so you can force it to boot directly into Windows from the BIOS, or to like a USB stick. Let's say, you're trying to install another, or that, yeah, well, you have boot override options here. That's what that is. You can save profiles, you can load profiles. I would strongly recommend if you have a motherboard with dual BIOS and no BIOS switches, like physical BIOS switches from Gigabyte, you should use a USB stick to save your profiles because the profiles are tied to the BIOS chip, and if the dual BIOS decides to randomly go from one BIOS to the next, you're going to lose, you're not going to lose all your profiles. They're just going to be on the other BIOS chip. So you're not going to be able to get to them until you crash the BIOS so many times that it goes back to the previous chip, right? So yeah, that's a bit silly. But on a motherboard like this, the Xtreme, the Master, they both have dual BIOS switches, and then actually the rest of the X570 lineup from Gigabyte doesn't have dual BIOS, so it's not really a problem anymore. But on older Gigabyte motherboards, that was a major issue. It was just like, oh great, now I lost all my profiles. This board, not really a concern. A lot of the X570 boards, not a concern, but yeah. That's like one of the reasons to save on a USB. The other reason to save profiles to a USB is if you want to you have a friend who has has a very similar system to you. You want to give him a profile instead of telling him how to set all the settings. That's another use for the USB stick option. The thing is, BIOS profiles do not necessarily carry over from BIOS version to BIOS version. So if you save a BIOS profile on, say, version F5B that we have here, and then there's a version F6, you might find that the F5B BIOS profiles do not work on F6 because there might have been some changes in terms of options in the BIOS, and so the profiles are no longer compatible. Anyway, I do believe that covers absolutely everything. Right, because we've got to the save and exit menu. I've showed you how to insert, insert things in the favorites menu. So you can insert things here like that. You can actually, if you feel like it, you can destroy your favorites menu like that. You can just remove everything if you don't want to use it, and rebuild it from scratch as you see fit. And yeah, so that is everything in the Gigabyte X570 Xtreme BIOS. And this BIOS should be, like, if you have a X570 Master from Gigabyte, it should be extremely similar. You have the rest, like, if you have, like, a Pro or a Elite, or you have a iPro, so the ITX board, the BIOS will look very, very similar, but it will not be exactly the same. For example, those boards don't have the same kind of clock gen for their BCLK, so they're not going to have, well, this many BCLK settings. So, for one thing. So, yeah, that's kind of that with the BIOS walkthrough. So hopefully this was helpful. And yeah, like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below if you'd like to support what I do here with actually... Oh, wait, I forgot. I have the motherboard was provided to me by Gigabyte, so big thanks to Gigabyte for sending one of these over. And yeah, that's with that out of the way, back to doing the YouTube outro. So yeah, like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon where you can support me directly. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where there's stickers, there's posters, there's shirts, there's socks, there's even hoodies. Yeah, so if you'd like to support me through that, because, I don't know, you don't like Patreon for some reason, you can go buy a shirt, you know, and yeah, that helps out with running the channel as well. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. And I need to... Yes, this mouse... Oh boy, where is it? There it is. Okay, stop. Goodbye.